everybody, I'm Tiffany Weber. I'm a real estate attorney in Mooresville, North Carolina, and today we're going to talk about 3 things that will delay your closing and how to avoid them. The North Carolina offer to purchase contains a lot of information about your purchase and sale of real property, but contrary to popular belief, it does not contain all of the information needed to perform and execute the closing. So, if an attorney sends a buyer or seller information sheet, that means they need more information. So your failure to return an information sheet is going to be a leading indicator of whether your closing will be delayed. In fact, sellers specifically, if you fail to return your information sheet, then we can pretty much guarantee that the closing will not be able to happen on time. And that's because most sellers have a mortgage on their homes that need to be paid off before the closing. And we can't obtain an accurate payoff statement without the seller's written consent. And that's what the information sheet does, is we get the seller's written consent to obtain the payoff statement, and we're able to submit that to their lender to get the payoff statement in time for the closing. Now, most of these statements take 2 to 14 days to arrive, and we can't accept a recent loan statement because it doesn't contain an accurate payoff, and we won't be able to get down to the closest penny that we can to pay off the mortgage and get the seller their proceeds. Now, you should understand that the closing attorney will not close without an accurate payoff statement. So without that seller information sheet, there's most likely not going to be a closing until it's returned. Now, there are similar issues if a purchaser does not return their information sheet on time, but thankfully those can typically be remedied in time for the closing and won't cause as much of a delay as a seller failing to return their information sheet. The next thing that's most likely to delay your closing is a lack of communication. So don't assume that just because your agent knows something, or maybe one of the other parties knows something, that the closing attorney's office knows. For example, if you need special accommodations for your closing, like a mail away or a power of attorney, but you haven't told the closing attorney's office, then we're going to get to the day of closing and not have any idea and not be able to complete that power of attorney or get the mail away package done. So that's certainly going to delay your closing. Other things that people conveniently forget to tell us is that they're married. So they may have omitted that they have a spouse on their information sheet, and that could be because they bought the property before they were married and assumed that their spouse didn't have to sign. But in North Carolina, in almost all cases, unless there are special conditions met, then a spouse is going to have to sign at closing. So if you show up at closing without your spouse and we find out you're married, then you're not going to be able to sign all of the closing documents without your spouse, and you're not going to be able to get your proceeds. So make sure you tell us you have your spouse and that you bring your spouse to closing so that you don't have any delays. Other things that people forget to tell us and we can find out at the closing table that are likely to delay your closing are if there are any special concessions to be made by the seller, say a drop in price, a seller credit, or if there were any repairs that had to be completed before the closing could happen. If we find that out at the table and you're handing us an invoice and saying, oh, this is supposed to be on the closing statement, then it's going to cause at least a tiny bit of a delay because the lender is going to have to likely approve any changes to the closing statement. So even if it's just an hour delay, that's still a delay of your closing. Some of those things can cause bigger issues and it could be delayed by days, but usually if you can get us the information as quickly as possible, then we'll be able to minimize delays to your closing, but they'll still be delayed. So the safe thing to do is if you didn't tell the closing attorney's office yourself, assume they don't know. We don't mind finding out information more than once, but not finding it out at all can cause issues. The final thing that's likely to delay your closing is the failure to send your money in on time. In North Carolina, a closing attorney cannot record the deed until the buyer and the lender's funds are in the attorney's trust account. And attorneys require that funds over a certain amount be wired. So if you haven't wired your funds, then you're not going to close. Now, some banks require that you make an appointment, or if you have a bank that's out of state, you have to be in person to initiate your wire. So we have unfortunately seen where someone assumed that they could send a wire from their phone at the closing table, but they actually needed to be in person in Pennsylvania to initiate their wire. So that definitely delayed their closing by several days because they had to go back to Pennsylvania, initiate their wire, and then everything had to be redone so that they could close once the money got into the attorney's trust account. The safe thing to do here is as soon as you go under contract, Whatever bank you're going to be initiating your wire from, contact them and find out their requirements for sending a wire. If you need an appointment, make an appointment. I understand that you're likely not going to have the final numbers for your closing until potentially the day of closing, but in most cases, and call the attorney's office to make sure, you can send an amount that is as close as you can get, and then any minor differences, say you were short a couple $100s, can be written by a personal check or some other method. Or if you sent too much money, then the attorney will cut you a check back or wire your funds back that same day of closing, just to make sure that everything is squared away. So don't worry if you don't have the final numbers. Get as close as you can. Just don't wait to send the wire until you're at the closing table, because your deed's not going to be recorded until all the money is in the attorney's trust account. All right, so those are 3 common things that are likely to delay your closing, and you've heard ways that you can avoid those. So don't make the same mistakes that some other people have that have caused their closings to be delayed. You know, you've got moving trucks, you're ready to get in your new house. Don't let one of these minor things be the reason that you can't get into your house when you're expecting to. All right, if you like learning more about real estate law in North Carolina, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We put out educational videos just like this all the time, and I'll see you in the next video.